Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. I don't know where you are in the world, but where I am, it's already the 4th day of Christmas, and on the 4th day of Christmas, my true love sent to me 4 calling birds, 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and a partridge in a pear tree. Humor may seem not to have a place in true crime, and even a sense of humor may seem not to have a place. And certainly one doesn't want to be too superficial about true crime, but in Auschwitz, for example, when people were dying, the only way that people stayed alive was and had hope in a period of despair was to kind of have a sense of humor. True crime tells us a little bit about not only the science of man, but how to deal with suffering almost as a science. And we get some insight from someone who experienced it firsthand, Viktor Frankl. And I'm going to read you this quote, which is, "The attempt to develop a sense of humor and to see things in a humorous light is kind of a trick learned while mastering the art of living. Yet it is possible to practice the art of living even in a concentration camp, although suffering is omnipresent. To draw an analogy, a man's suffering is similar to the behavior of gas. If a certain quantity of gas is pumped into an empty chamber, it will fill the chamber completely and evenly, no matter how big the chamber. Thus suffering completely fills the human soul and conscious mind, no matter whether the suffering is great or little. Therefore, the size of human suffering is absolutely relative." And the whole idea of the sense of humor is something that one can develop to hem in the spread of suffering, to provide a sort of oxygen supply while the gas of suffering is sort of enveloping a person. So before we get to this episode of True Crime Rocket Science, just a heads up that between now and the end of the year, I'll be doing a 5-part episode series on 23 years ago today, John Bonet. And before we get to that, there'll also be an episode on the murder weapon. There's also additional coverage in even more depth on the Patreon page of True Crime Rocket Science. That's Patreon /TCRS. But before we get to today's episode, which is number 6 in the series, if you haven't subscribed to this channel, please do. Ring the bell, like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So there are approximately 114 points that were laid down in mid-August to the end of August in 2018. I basically started putting down information as I received it on a particular blog post, which I titled, "What do we know so far?" And I maintained that blog post for over a year. So it went, August, September, October, up until October 2019. And the value of that blog post was really just to record the order in which, the chronology in which we found things out. And it's kind of interesting to go back in time and to see what we knew when we knew it. So in this episode, we'll be dealing with basically 10 additional points in August, 79 to 89. In the previous episode, we ended off with Watch showing no emotion, and then a source saying that in jail he was in mourning, and that he thought grief was starting to sink in. Now, what wasn't known then, what is very, I'm not sure how well it's known now, but I'm not sure what was really mourning in the sort of typical sense of the word. Watts had already agreed to the plea deal as early as around about 24th of August. There's an email referring to that. I'm not going into that here, but as late as a week after that, I think Watts sort of realized his life was over. That he'd gambled, he'd lost his girlfriend, he'd lost his wife, he destroyed his family, he destroyed himself, and he was kind of in mourning about that. And so that was the last point we dealt with in the previous episode, and now we go to number 79. So Shanann Watts' friend Ashley Bell told KDVR that the gender reveal party was going to be held at the Watts home on Saturday the 18th of August in the town of Frederick, north of Denver. Shanann and her children were murdered early on Monday morning, August 13th. Now what's very interesting about that point is how the narrative around that has shifted. So as a true crime writer, and as I was gathering this information, I thought that the gender reveal party was a significant aspect. I thought it was very significant, but I actually had no idea how significant it was. This particular point is quite misleading, because even though Ashley Bell is correct, she's not completely correct. So what had happened was Chris Watts had asked Shanann to postpone the gender reveal party, which she did, and so it was going to be held on Saturday the 18th of August. But then they kind of developed their marital troubles, and then there was a change in strategy, and what they decided then was that they were going to go to Aspen that weekend, that they were going to sort of do some marriage maintenance and sort out their marriage on that weekend. So instead of doing the gender reveal, they were going to go away and kind of repair their marriage. But as a result of that, as a result of this cancelling of the gender reveal on August 18th, it was actually going to be brought forward to the Monday that Shanann arrived. And I'm not quite sure what her plan was, but I think it was going to involve saying something on Facebook. She was going to the doctor that morning, and that was when she was going to, I guess, show photos or whatever. And Chris Watts had sort of talked her into already postponing the gender reveal, saying anything on Facebook. And so it eventually got postponed to the day of Shanann's death. And so this snippet is a little bit misleading, because, as I say, the gender reveal was ultimately going to happen at the very end of all the arrangements and so on. It was ultimately going to happen on the Monday that Shanann was murdered, and so she never ultimately got to do the gender reveal. I think the mainstream believe that the gender reveal is either irrelevant or has very little significance in all of this, because naturally Nicole Kessinger knew about the baby and she was having an affair regardless. And so all those people don't, I think, they don't really see any of the significance in the gender reveal. I do. I think it's totally different what a man thinks about the gender and the whole story, and also what is a man going to think about another woman knowing about something like that, including the paternity. So I think a lot of women are thinking about this just from the perspective of obviously someone else knew about it, but Nicole Kessinger didn't murder the family, Chris Watts did, and it was all around the gender reveal. I'm not going to go into that further here, but I will be dealing with the gender reveal in an episode on Patreon, so you can head on over for that. In point number 80, it was sort of dealing with a funeral that happened right at the end of the month in August. And I remember what really stood out for me looking at the funeral photos were the three coffins being sort of wheeled out of the church, three coffins at one funeral. And it was so weird how in that moment it really brought home the fact that what had happened. In reality there could have been four coffins, but still, seeing three coffins at one funeral it really brought home, kind of in a single image, the horrible tragedy that had actually happened here. I think it was also at this moment, I know I've referred to it earlier, but it was at this moment that I absorbed, sort of fully absorbed the fact that Shanann was spelt the way that it was, and I also got the other names. I also sort of had to decide whether I was going to call Nico with a C or Nico with a K, and the fact that the family had spelled it with a C was one argument, but the other argument was that Shanann herself had spelled his name with a K. And so that's the version I went with. I went with Shanann's version. Just referring back to some of the items listed here, one of them is that Colorado is one of 12 states in America without a law broadly allowing for homicide charges in the violent death of fetuses. Number 85, there may be further evidence on Trent Boult, the alleged gay lover of Chris Watts. So what was pretty incredible here was at the same time of the funeral, Trent Boult was sort of waving a flag, kind of saying me, and kind of directing, one could argue misdirecting a lot of attention towards himself. But just think about it, at around the time of this funeral, that's when it was happening. And my own feelings were that since it was Boult's own Facebook account and no other media was covering it, it just felt less and less likely that Boult did have anything to do with the Watts family. And I said at the time, personally, I still don't buy the Trent Boult gay lover theory, but here goes. And this referred to a post on September 1st. I'm not convinced he's telling the truth, but he apparently posted on his Facebook page that he met with detectives on Friday night and provided DNA samples, buccal swabs, and texts that he exchanged with Chris. He also said that they took towels that apparently had Chris's DNA on them. Also took a gold chain that Chris had given him for Valentine's Day. The detectives also told him he could have been next, that Chris was plotting against him because he blames him for breaking up his marriage after Shanann found texts from him to Chris on July 4th. Could it be true? I guess time will tell. Shanann was in North Carolina on July 4th. So how did she see the texts? Unless that's when Chris was visiting or she somehow had access to his texts. Also, he's been broken up with Chris since April and still has used towels laying around. But if it's true, it shows how messed up this guy was, that he could portray this devoted family man to the world. I'm not really going to go into that. Make of that what you will. Point number 86. You are always daddy's little girl, and that was something Frank Rusick said at the time of the funeral. We've always seen almost the most emotion from anybody, in this case from Frank Rusick, just written on his face, written in some of his words. And then point number 87, and this was from Frankie Rusick. From a young age I always knew my sister was going to be successful and nothing would stand in her way. She was born to be a mother. Boy, was she ready. Closets were full even before she knew she was pregnant. She couldn't wait. She was my mom, times 10, whether either one of them wanted to admit it. She had ambition in her eyes and wanted a great life for her children and herself. She was ready to take on the world, and we know she did. Frankie Rusick. I'm sure a lot of people will probably find the rest maybe a bit uncomfortable, maybe they don't want to hear this. I'm simply providing the information that I provided at the time. So if you want to turn the video off, pay attention to what you want to hear, you're welcome to do that. But the rest of the message reads, the rest of the chronological record at the time read, notice the mismatch between Frank's message and her brother's. So what Frankie had said was about his sister at the funeral, and the mismatch was basically that funerals are all about sentiment, and it may be unkind to read too deeply into emotional messages, but It's also at funerals where a crucial aspect is revealed, the identity of the victims. You sort of remember who someone was, who were they really. And part of that sort of came through just in the spelling of Shanann's name. You suddenly see this is how her name was spelled. Funny enough, we're getting into the same territory with Megan Broussard. No one knows how to pronounce her name, no one knows how to spell her name, but the fact that there are these differences in spelling in different social media and so on, one must also ask the question, why is that? Why has someone sort of got different names and surnames and spellings? What's going on there? Where does that come from? And so what I wrote at the time in point number 87 was, what we get here is this contrasting idea of someone who is prepared and ready and someone who is in a sense still a little girl. It's not necessarily the case that murder victims are naive. Sometimes killers are cold, cruel and callous, no matter how paranoid their prey. But in a family murder, we really do have to look at the idea of naivete and vulnerability. Were either of these adults really ready to take on the world? Were they really ready to be married? Were they really ready to be parents? Was the one more ready than the other in one area and the other less ready than the other in another area? If we consider this idea from the perspective of the two meeting on Facebook, it casts further aspersions on their experience of real life and real love. Couldn't they meet the right people in the real world, the right way, right in inverted commas? Or is meeting people on Facebook with a view to romance the new normal? If so, how do we tell what's not normal on social media? Number 88, a colleague of Shanann's told WRAL that the couple was having problems and that Shanann's mother, Sandy Onorati, told her that Shanann and Chris were planning to separate. It may be that Shanann was continuing to peddle a fairy tale on social media simply to make money. Now, I highlighted this in red kind of as a note to myself to say, what if Shanann, and bear in mind this was several months before the discovery came out, but it was this idea of a person whose job it was to sell the Thrive fairy tale, and everyone had the idea that the Watts family were this beautiful fairy tale. Everybody was happy, and that's why everyone paid so much attention to it. It didn't make any sense. Why did this happen when they're such a beautiful family? They all look so happy. What's going on? But meanwhile, there was another face to the family. There was another face to what was being seen in the photos, on social media. And I've just written about the same thing with John Bonet. You had this beautiful child pageant queen and this perfect American family, but meanwhile there was a lot of darkness and shadow in the background, bedwetting and a lot of other stuff. But in the Watts case, you kind of had the situation of putting this fairy tale on social media, and then the question was, did Shanann know that things weren't going well, but she continued to peddle the fairy tale regardless because she was sort of desperate to make money? Now, people will say you are victim blaming, etc., etc. What you're not seeing is through that, if you're brave enough to acknowledge that, if you're brave enough to just say, well, maybe that was true, and you can say, so what? Not so what. If that is true, you have a situation where the husband, the disenfranchised, disenchanted, disillusioned husband, is well aware that his wife is sort of using Facebook more than usual, more than average, and he wants to get out of his marriage. He wants to get out of his fatherhood and his wife being pregnant, and his wife is very, very vocal. She's a Facebook maven, and this presents kind of a threat to him. If you contrast the idea of putting things on social media to make money, to sell Thrive and so on, by the same token you can think how that turns around when the crap hits the fan, when the pawpaw hits the fan. What happens when there's not a very nice story, about infidelity and betrayal? Is there then also a social media story dealing with that? You're going to have instead of Nutgate, are you going to have Mistress Gate? And if you are going to have Mistress Gate, what are the consequences going to be? Is somebody going to lose money? In the same way that you peddle a fairy tale on social media, maybe to make money, to sell thrive, can you also make money by, in terms of a divorce, by kind of controlling your spouse and making sure that you either get revenge on them or that they pay a price for what you are saying about them on social media, and so they can lose things as well. They can lose their home, they can lose their job, they can lose their mistress, so they can basically lose everything if this happens. And this is just talking about this idea of being very determined to tell stories on social media. And this brings us to the final point in episode 6. According to the Daily Beast, 2 friends said Shanann had confided in them that Chris was cheating on her. 2 of Shanann's friends said she suspected Chris was cheating on her. Amanda Thayer told Denver 7 that Shanann thought infidelity was a possibility, but it said that Chris wasn't a player. At the same time, she was like, he has no game. He didn't have it with her when they first met. She did everything, Thayer said. Nicole Atkinson, the last person besides Chris to see Shanann alive, told ABC News that Shanann entertained the idea that he was unfaithful, because, and this is Nicole Atkinson's words, he wasn't being the loving Chris that he normally was. He wasn't touching or hugging or doing stuff like that. He wasn't being as attentive to the girls as he normally is, Atkinson said. And it's in this area that I think a lot of people are being quite schizophrenic, where you hear about Chris Watts being a narcissist, and you hear about Chris Watts being a psychopath, and you hear about Chris Watts not showing any emotion. What about this, the loving Chris that he normally was, the loving Chris that was touching and hugging and doing stuff like that, the loving Chris that now wasn't being as attentive to the girls as he normally was because he was now being attentive to someone else? And if you take this narrative of being naive, and people seem to resent it, but if you resent it, think about it in terms of yourself. Haven't you ever been naive about how someone has treated you, and then realized all along you've been misled, you've been betrayed, you saw signs but you hoped that it was something else? All we're trying to do is look into this situation and see how this may have happened, and maybe look at that and see, wow, this is how it can happen. How could it happen with you? How could it happen with me? Has it happened? Is it happening? And so besides the social media fairy tale, if you're going to peddle fairy tales on social media, to what extent can you peddle fairy tales to yourself? To what extent can you lie to yourself? And right now we're in the middle of Christmas, and we're about to go into the new year, and we're going to say to ourselves, 2020 is going to be a good year. How realistic are we being about it, or are we fooling ourselves? How realistic is something like Christmas, which is based on rituals and traditions and also fairy tales? Some of the fairy tales serve us, but some of it is, I don't want to go so far as to say is lying to ourselves, but you're sort of seeing certain things, you're not seeing certain things, and as a result, often during the fairy tale of Christmas there are serious arguments and unhappiness, and this time of good cheer often is miserable to a lot of people. And something I saw on CNN recently was, a woman went to McDonald's because she thought her husband was going to kill her or something. That has happened now, kind of over the festive season. And subsequently, after this woman mouthed the words "help me," they found that this guy had a gun in the car, and it wasn't his car, it was her car. And he'd kind of forced her to drive somewhere, and when she went to the McDonald's, he didn't want her to talk to anyone, so he went sort of in with her, and then she said she wanted to order food. But the point is, this woman wasn't naive. She kind of figured what was going on, and this may have saved her life. And it's around this Christmas period. This happened on around about December 26th, 27th. So at this time that you want to be happy and you want to enjoy the idea of, family cheer, are you seeing the signals? Are you believing in something when the signals are pointing to something else or not. And so just a final thing in this regard, I posted on Crime Rocket just a story about, this was sent to me on Patreon. It was a woman who came across this and just found it interesting, but it was a blonde woman and a quite a good looking guy who appeared on Oprah, and the whole thing was about just how controlling this woman was. And then the cameras actually went into their home, and you just saw how the woman would tell the guy what to do, and he was very good natured about it, but he was also very sort of quiet, and she would make lists of things that she expected from him. And the question was she too controlling or not? And some people blamed her, some people blamed him, some people blamed both of them. But what was not in dispute was that there was a lot of control going on, and both people were kind of unhappy. And when Dr. Phil sort of came on, like to answer the question, is there anything wrong with this picture? He kind of made a joke because it was so wrong. Right at the end, when this woman was on Dr. Phil, she was sort of insisting how what she was doing was good for him, that he was happy with what was going on. And Dr. Phil sort of chided her, saying, the reason he's not doing anything about what you're saying is, he doesn't want you to dog his ass the whole time. So in other words, he just withdraws and lets you have your way so that there's not drama, right? And that creates kind of a fairy tale. It kind of creates a fairy tale where one person kind of gets their way and another one doesn't, and maybe that allows a certain amount of harmony. But is that a fairy tale? Is that thriving? Is that what happened with Chris Watts? And so there's a weird mirror to what Chris Watts did, obviously not justified at all in doing what he did to his family, but he does what he does. He sort of puts his family through a holocaust of death and destruction, and then next thing he's on the sermon on the porch telling a fairy tale, saying that Shanann just went to a friend with the kids, on a play date. That's the fairy tale he weaves. And the question that true crime asks of all of us is, are we able to see through the fairy tales? Are we able to see the nightmare underneath the fairy tales? And that's the end of episode 6. Thank you for listening. Bear in mind there'll be a couple of episodes on the John Benet Ramsey case, just dealing with 23 years ago today, John Benet. Just a couple of episodes regarding that. If you haven't subscribed to this channel and you want to follow some of that coverage, ring the bell. And in terms of this video, please like, share, leave a comment. For those interested in the Watts case, there's episode 4 in the Atkinson transcripts. Some very interesting analysis there from the person closest to Shanann, and the person closest really to the events as they played out on August 13th. So if you want to catch that, please become my patron on Patreon, on Patreon/TCRS. Thank you for listening.